Good morning, everybody. Sorry we're a minute late, but very excited to be here, so thank you all. Last Thursday, we launched this series, Workforce, Workplace, Marketplace, Embedding Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and we talked about getting uncomfortable. I've been working with Mass TLC for many years now, spotlighting the lack of diversity and equity in the Mass tech sector. And what I've learned is we haven't really moved the needle much. So today I am really excited because I've just in the past few weeks talking to our panelists today and the panelists across this series have just learned so much. And if we continue to help and support the tech sector, move the needle, become a more diverse industry, then we can also help with the inequities across education, healthcare, and housing as well. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our series sponsors, Wayfair and Mimecast, and also Akamai and PTC, who are underwriting our entire social justice initiatives, including our Tech Compact for Social Justice. If you're not aware of the Compact, you can learn all about it at our website. Please ask questions throughout using the question function in the toolbox. We'll be answering them as we have breaks throughout the conversation, and then we'll also have a formal Q&A at the end. Today, we'll hear from companies of different sizes, stages, and sectors, share some of the successes they have achieved in building out their DEI toolkits. And now I'm happy to introduce you to our moderator today, Andre Green, Executive Director of Skillworks.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Andre Green. As Sarah said, I'm Executive Director of Skillworks. Skillworks is a funders collaborative co-hosted by this City of Boston and the Boston Foundation. Funders Collaborative is actually a really fancy way of saying that what we do is we brought together City of Boston, Boston Foundation, and about 10 other private funders to do what we call collective grant making and field building in the area of workforce development, which is to say that we make grants as a unit. We also sponsor technical assistance, coaching, and advocacy work, all aimed at improving not just workforce development programming in the city of Boston, but the larger ecosystem around which we do this work of developing workforce talent and using that as a tool to increase and improve racial equity. So I am thrilled and we are honored to be joined with three amazing individuals who are doing really excellent work in promoting DEI, both in their own companies and more broadly. So as I say your name, just wave. So we have Rory Anderson, who has been the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts for the past year, partnering with associates across the country to help make healthcare work better for all and is becoming more comfortable being uncomfortable, which I hope you will talk about in a little second. We have Nicole Keegan, who is TrueMotion's Director of Human Resources. At TrueMotion, she leads all things people with a passion for DEI and creating an inclusive company culture. And we have KeyAnna Schmiedl, who is the current head of culture and inclusion at Wayfair, with a 10+ history in the space of org development and DEI and a keen interest in bridging the divide between these two concepts. So, I'm going to start with actually a fairly big question, and I think I'll start with KeyAnna answering it first, but I'm going to start with why does DEI, why does diversity, equity, and inclusion matter?
Sure, thank you, and hello to everyone. Thank you for taking your time to be with us today. What I would say to this question that is so big is DEI matters because it's one of the unique opportunities that we have in organizations to bring people together and to bridge the gaps that a lot of us find, even just working in our silos on a day-to-day basis. It really allows us to get into what is human about being at work and what allows us to bring our whole selves to work, which in turn allows us to take advantage of all of the benefits that diversity and especially an inclusive environment have to offer. I think what's important to note is because it bridges this divide and brings a lot of folks together, you're also able to then build a coalition of people to support the work and the effort, right? And so it's one of those opportunities where it should certainly be led and shepherded by someone to make sure that there is ownership and an eye on the ball at all times, but also a bigger opportunity to say, we're not in this alone. And we need many, many hands to do the work and make light work of a lot of this. And it's an opportunity for folks, you know, whether it's leadership or career development or, you know, getting out there in a way that they would love to, but don't always have the opportunity to use their voices, to use their skill sets, to figure out what are the ways in which they as an individual can impact positive change in an organization, which really brings back, you know, that commitment to the organization and again to that sense of pride and belonging in an organization.
Great. Nicole, Rory, do you want to tackle the question next?
Yeah, I love the way that you put that. And I think there are so many reasons you could list for why DEI is so important. And for us, we really boiled it down at TrueMotion. That we wanted to find a really diverse group of ideas and voices in people to work in our company, and more so to that it was everyone has the right to work somewhere where they can be successful. And so it was really our job to build that environment where all voices could succeed, in the self that they brought to work had the chance to do that. So that was a huge goal for us.
Rory?
Yeah, thanks, Andre, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to speak with you. Difficult to follow up the past two responses, but if we think about Blue Cross and we think about us having the position of being the largest health insurer in the state, we have just under 3 million members. If we start with our focus on our members, and it's about putting our members' health first and to make quality healthcare affordable for all. If we think about some of those trends at the national level where racial and ethnic minorities, they currently make up about a third of the US population and expected to become a majority in about 20 years. If you think about those national trends, how they translate to the state trends and how they translate to our 3 million members. And there is a trend, an increasing trend, that our membership is becoming more and more multicultural. So as that happens, we have to stop and think about how does our multicultural membership interact with the healthcare system, not just with the health plan, but with the healthcare system as a whole. And we also have to flip that conversation and to ask ourselves, how does the healthcare system interact with multicultural members? How do they interact with different communities, with different ethnicities, with different cultures? And it's very disparate and it's very different. So as we think about servicing and supporting our members, we need to have that multicultural lens through which we can view challenges and opportunities and way to service our members to make that quality of healthcare affordable. So it really just enriches all of our work. And as we're doing that, we're hopeful that it enriches the lives and the health of our members. So that's probably the strongest and most compelling reason why diversity, equity, and inclusion needs to have a place in healthcare and certainly at Blue Cross of Massachusetts.
Thank you. I noticed that all of you mentioned that it improves the work. You know, organizational development, as Nicole knows, human resources has been studying this for years, and that is a clear and real thing that the data clearly shows. But I feel like, as we have to do today, we always have to start the conversation with, why should I care about DEI? So I really appreciate that you all were willing to take that moment to discuss it. And I guess I would like to then, you know, and I'm going to start, I'm actually going to start with Nicole, even though building off something KeyAnna said about many hands make light work. And, you know, I think I have two people whose job has equity in their title. But I'll start with the person who doesn't, because I want to talk about what is your role in this work and how do you think that speaks to organizational culture? So I'm going to start with Nicole.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. My full day job isn't just about DEI. It's, you know, all the HR stuff that comes along with that. And I think we're a much smaller organization than Wayfair Blue Cross. We're about 150 employees. And so I think naturally that work falls into the HR team in a great way, because it's really our responsibility to build process and policies and build systems that are inclusive of everyone and where everyone can succeed. And, you know, even down to the working practices or your meeting norms. I mean, there's a lot of tactical and practical things that you can build to help people be successful. But the thing that I personally learned really early on is that the work cannot just come from the HR department. I think a lot of the sessions I used to go to focused on getting executive buy-in for DEI programs and how to get your leadership team involved, which is really important. But for me, I realized very early on, it's actually about getting your team really engaged. And so getting their voices on what you should be focusing on and the goals, and making it part of everyone's responsibility to build that culture. Because HR can't be in every meeting and in every conversation. And so it's really equipping people with those tools to be able to operate, you know, as change agents on your behalf.
Excellent. Rory, I know you're new-ish to your role, so anything you want to add? And
yeah, thank you for calling that out, Andre. So I am new to the role, and I don't mind saying that prior to being in this role, I was a director of the HR Business Partner Group, and I was working with a lot of different areas across the company, and I felt that I was a strong and vocal and visible advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the most humbling experiences for me over the past year, and there have been many instances where I'm just racked with that insecurity and that who am I to be in this role? And I've come to realize that it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with the role and how we can turn it into a platform and use it to build forums. But I think if you asked me a year ago whether or not I was a visible and vocal champion and advocate of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I would have said absolutely. And my personal learning has been that that's not the case. I certainly understood and then try to incorporate and integrate the principles and themes and the important work that goes on in our DE&I group, but I don't think I ever really truly embraced it. So that's been a very challenging part about me stepping into this role this past year. And yes, there's been a lot going on, but I think even outside of that, in the normal day-to-day, I just wasn't prepared for all the effort and all the work and all the advocating it takes to really embed some of those DEI practices into the business areas, into other functions, even within HR, to build on Nicole's comments. So it's been a really heavy lift, and I've come to admire and I've come to be so impressed by folks who have made this their career. And so much of this has been about building my stamina over the past year, and it's woefully inadequate. So for folks who have been doing this for a long time, I just admire the stamina that they built up because it takes a lot of work. So the way that we've seen some really good progress, building on Nicole's comment earlier, is that we've been on a journey at Blue Cross, and a couple of years ago, we got the diversity, equity, inclusion strategy, which is framed around 4 C's. We got that integrated and incorporated into the enterprise strategy. And when you have an enterprise strategy that feeds into business plans, that ultimately leads to goals by which leaders are held accountable. And that's really when you can start making that traction, because that little adage, what gets measured, what gets done. And it allows us to really focus in on, with everything that's nuanced and everything is gray with regards to goals and metrics that we agree on and we put into place. That's about as close to black and white as you can get in this space, so we can focus in on those tangible measurements of progress. So we've been able to do that over the past couple of years. And the catalyst for this year that really has allowed us to go a little further, and we can talk about this more, is how COVID-19 has had that horrific and disparate impact on the Black and Brown communities in Massachusetts. It's put a magnifying glass in health disparities that have always been there. And it took this pandemic to really lift that up for everybody to see, to be put in plain view. And for us as a health plan, as a healthcare company, to understand and acknowledge that we have to do more in the space of health disparities. And if we're going to understand health disparities, we have to understand structural racism. And so as our enterprise is focused on that, that has created a platform for us to work with leaders across the board, to contextualize the work going on with health disparities, and to talk about structural racism, to understand that, and to really have everybody start thinking about what are those things that we need to be aware of, those biases, that structural racism, that historic racism. Because if we're going to do good work to combat health disparities, we need to understand that. So that's created a new opportunity to further embed this in the enterprise. and make it the responsibility of the leadership team and associates across the company.
You said something in there that I found really interesting, and Nicole touched on it as well. And I'm going to come back to it, but first I want to see if KeyAnna has anything she wants to add to the.
Yeah, so I am a true systems thinker at heart, and my head is going to a number of different places. I'm going to see if I can connect all of this together, but if not, these disparate points all matter. So what I would say is an echo and a build off of everything that has been said already. Look, I think, you know, why this work matters and why I have committed to doing this work for as long as I have is getting folks to understand that inclusion is so critical to alleviating a lot of the pressure that you feel when you leave work or shut down for the day and realize I've been holding back a significant part of myself because it didn't feel like it was welcome at work or that it was safe here. That takes a toll, right? And it causes a lot of folks over time to just wear down. And we don't want that for our people. We want our people to be happy, healthy, and you know, at their peak so that they can contribute their best, right? Like we want to invest in our people in that way. And I think for a long time, topics like diversity, equity, and inclusion were like, you know, not to be mentioned in the workplace. And so we were conditioned that it's awkward to bring it up, that we shouldn't be talking about this, that really that's not meant to be a conversation that happens here and that nobody is equipped to have this conversation. So we're breaking down a lot of years of we don't talk about this at work and saying we absolutely have to talk about this at work. And from a generational perspective, that's really hard, right? Like you don't want to assume that everybody is as prepared as everyone else. And it's not about a younger generation or an older generation, because I think that there are, you know, misses and ads on both ends of the spectrum. But I do think it's about helping everyone to see themselves when you say the word diversity. You know, when we say diversity, traditionally, especially in the United States, what people automatically think of is gender. They think of race, ethnicity, and, you know, sometimes LGBTQIA+, but a lot of times it stops at gender and race and ethnicity. And so that has allowed a lot of people to opt out, to hear the word diversity and say, oh, they're not talking about something for me, so I don't have to pay attention. And a lot of this work is doing the backgrounding to say, no, when I say diversity, I mean all of us. So when we're talking about a specific group, we have to be able to call that out. And that's what gets uncomfortable. We're used to using broad generalization. So how do we get comfortable being uncomfortable with, feels weird to hear me say white people, right? But we say Black people and Latinx people all the time, right? Like we say the LGBTQIA+ community or trans community or, you know, whatever community all the time, but we don't mention the language that goes along with the majority group. And in order to move this work forward, in order to get to a place where we truly have inclusion, where there's buy-in for the equitable processes that need to be built to you know, create that balance that allows us to get to equality, we need all hands on deck. We need our white partners. We need our cisgendered straight partners, right? We need our folks who are in their 20s. We need our folks who are in their 60s and 70s. And so really this is an opportunity for us to realize what is different about us and how it helps to bring that together, as opposed to realizing what's different about us and staying in those silos.
Great. Before we move on to use cases, as I mentioned, Rory pointed out, I think very clearly, but I think both Nicole and KeyAnna have touched on this idea of stamina and this idea of being able to stay in the work. And I would love it if briefly the three of you could talk about your experiences with that and what does it mean to build it up for you? And I don't know who goes first.
Yeah, Andre, I'll go ahead and I'll take a swing at this. So personally, when I talk about stamina, it's speaking about exactly what KeyAnna was saying too, to get more comfortable speaking about race and difference and equity and structural racism, you know, in a healthcare context at work. And I'm sure it's been amplified by the sudden and seemingly violent collision of work life and home life when, you know, the vast majority of us started working remotely. And you see the camera back here, people can see my room, people can see the art on my walls, the art that isn't on my walls, the lack of family photos, all different things like that to really set yourself up for people to have this window into your life that heretofore has been private. And as a HR professional throughout my career, if you would have had a leader reach out to me last year, 12 months ago and say, hey, I want to facilitate a conversation in a safe space with my entire division, and I want to talk about structural racism, I mean, the response just would have been like, what is going on here? Because again, to speak to Nicole and to KeyAnna's points, there have been systems in place, systems that led to structures in place, and what you do and what you don't talk about work. You can acknowledge certain things that people have going on, but as far as bringing your whole self to work, that has been more of a phrase. Now we're bringing our homes, we're bringing our rooms, we're bringing our kids who run in here because they need tech support or something like that. This is the manifestation of bringing your whole self to work, whether leaders want it or not. So it's building up that level of stamina to talk about racial equity, structural racism, health disparities, and being in the position of being a health plan where you're seeing a lot of this data, you're hearing a lot of these anecdotes, you're talking to folks out in the community, and you're seeing this humongous impact that COVID-19, the social injustice, the inequity across the country, and especially in the healthcare spectrum, is wreaking on our members and our community partners, and it's brutal. And there's no place to go without escaping all that stress that you have at home that you have to manage. So that stamina, that's what I'm talking about, and also helping leaders who have never spoken about race and difference in a work setting, not just helping them get comfortable that one time where they're having that conversation, but to do it continually, because this needs to be a continuous conversation. And for me personally, that has just been absolutely exhausting. It's extremely motivating to see that how we as a company were evolving to encourage and support these conversations, but it's exhausting. I never experienced it before, and I'm getting a little better at it, and a little ahead of the journey compared to some of the other leaders that we have that we're working with. But I know firsthand how exhausting it is. So there is that stamina aspect. So we speak openly about it, that this is going to be exhausting. You need to find a way to build back up your strength, because we're going to have to continue these conversations. So.
I love that. That is, I think protecting your stamina is so important. And one thing that 2020, I feel like, has really taught me is respecting other people's stamina, because people have had just such a difficult year, and for a lot of different reasons. Everyone has a different home life and a different journey that they're on, and it's respecting that people have different points of exhaustion. So in a number of our internal ERGs, like our women's group, normally it's quite structured and we have goals for the year and we're very aggressive in our growth. And this year, a lot of the women in that group are just like, I am tapped out. I am exhausted from numerous different reasons. And I just need this group to be a safe place where I can come and unload. I don't have time to dedicate to TrueMotion's DEI goals this year. Like, I barely have time to keep my head afloat. And that was really, I was so grateful that they felt safe enough to say that to us. Like, listen, I still care about DEI and TrueMotion. I still care about this journey, but like, I don't have any more of myself to give. And it's being really respectful of that. So that's one of the things that I've learned about stamina this year, particularly.
I think along the lines of many hands make light work. What I realized, after the events in late May and early June were the ways in which we needed to protect Way Black, our Black ERG, and how we needed other folks to step in, right? Out of that, both protecting stamina and saying, like, we need to create an in space where they can feel comfortable, just having conversations amongst themselves and deciding how they would like to move forward without like noise and influence from external voices. A wonderful thing happened, which was Allies for Black Lives Matter started here. And it was a bunch of folks who wanted to support the Black community, but did not themselves identify as Black. And so they created that space to say, hey, we shouldn't be taxing these folks right now with questions that we can very well research ourselves. We should be bringing to them opportunities for them to get involved if they would like to, but us to say, hey, we've got this from here, right? We're going to go out and have these conversations for other folks like ourselves who maybe don't know as much, you know, are finding these things shocking, did not know that these health disparities existed before COVID-19 and are just waking up to this being a new world. I think in the most positive and the most negative of ways, I have never been more conscientious of me being a Black woman than I have in this moment, right? And so during this time, even for myself, what I realized was that there was this hidden graciousness in COVID-19, you know, in the privilege of me being able to work from home and not having a job where I had to show up still in the, you know, work environment every day, because I could shut off my computer and just sob. And I also realized that I don't know that I ever would have done that, even by the time I got home or during my commute, if I had been in the office during this time. And so for me, that was the realization of the myriad of ways in which I wasn't bringing my full self to work because I felt like it was inappropriate or didn't translate the right message for folks to see that, right? And those are the kinds of conversations and the kinds of discussions that we bring to our Change Starts at Home series, because it's incredibly important for people to understand. Look, to the point that Rory made about people seeing into our rooms now, right? When we had a conversation about pride, and a few of our members of the Way Out ERG and Trans and Tech ERG spoke up, some of them shared that this was the first time ever that they've had stable housing where they would feel comfortable even turning a camera on. Some of them shared that this was the first time where they were able to carve out a space for themselves. And so they have been buying stuff to put up on display because they finally have that space. And other people were sharing that this is a time that's really hard for them because it was critically important for them to keep separate their work life and their home life. Right. And so saying, hey, we're encouraging or we're mandating screens to be on, where does that straddle the line of inclusive and exclusive? And so I think it's really just opened up the nuance in the discussion in a way that you can't get at when everybody is in the same space together. And so in terms of stamina, I think being able to shut off my computer, or my camera does a lot for me in back building that stamina, but it also is a little bit exhausting, right? Like I have a sign here that people can typically see when it's up, and I didn't even realize it the first time that I had it up until somebody like slacked me during a Change Starts at Home and was like, oh my gosh, I love your Trust Your Dopeness art. And I, in that moment, realized, oh, I put that in a space where other people can see it. And that was a moment for me to wrangle with. And why is that bringing up something for me? Was it that I'm nervous about people seeing it? What is that? Right? And how many of our people are doing that on a regular basis? I think, when we first went to work from home, I was also still nursing my youngest son. And so the panic of, oh my gosh, I hope this camera is off right now because I forgot to check that. And this would be really awkward during a team meeting, right? Like those things come up, but they're also the things that make people realize, oh, that's not KeyAnna, head of DEI, that's KeyAnna, human being, right? And that's so important, right? The second that I see you as a human is the second that I feel some connectivity to you that I didn't have before. And being able to bring that and me being able to witness seeing that happen for so many folks in our organization is really what helps me to keep going in terms of, building that stamina.
Thank you. That was all amazing, and I, kind of wish we could do a whole panel discussion about the ways in which working from home is your whole self. As I sit behind a blank wall that I haven't put art on yet because I just moved. But I do want to make sure that we get to the use cases, because you all brought concrete examples of things you've done at your organizations to positively impact the DEI work. So I want to make sure we get a chance to hear those. But with the, so please tell us about something you've done at your organization and how it's moved to work. And we'll start with KeyAnna.
Great. So I think, getting back to how Rory kind of kicked us off with this idea of thinking systemically, something that I've tried to do here is really bring about this idea of a culture of inclusion, and so that people don't center the work on myself or my team, but rather understanding what are they bringing to the culture that either signals inclusion or doesn't. And one of the ways that we've gone about that is to balance qualitative and quantitative data and actually dig into our qualitative data in the same way that we do the quantitative data. So some of you may have heard me mention previously this idea of the natural language process analysis and really digging into what are the words that we're using when we write about people in performance reviews or during the recruiting process, and how does that help us to discern where there are opportunity areas for us in terms of mitigating bias and being more inclusive. And so we've been able to boil down to specific words, right, by dimension of diversity. We started with women in this confidence study. Coming up with the word confidence is probably not a surprise that comes up often as an opportunity area for women. But what we were able to do was to say, okay, but we also have concrete data points that say in terms of communication and persuasion, women on average at Wayfair rate higher in that area. So we're not using confidence in the way that you would think. So if we're using it in a subjective way, how can we pressure test this more often and have people, call each other out in a space of learning in order to really kind of change the dynamic and how we understand what do we mean when we say confidence. We recently just shared internally the same information for our non-white, non-Asian populations, which in our corporate offices would be underrepresented groups. And we came up with the same kind of playbook. We said, okay, great. What we're going to do is we're going to work this language into calibration facilitator training, calibration monitor training. We're going to share it out with all reporting managers. We're going to let people know that here is the flag, because so often people, once they get bought into DEI work, they're like, now what do I do? And there's this bit of paralyzation that happens when you say, there's so many different things we could tackle. What's the one thing that I can do? And for us, it's about where can we be bold enough to say we want to lead in this space and not just meet parity with other organizations. We want to push that conversation, and we're willing to meet you where you're at, but we're also going to push you to get to where we want to go. And we want to bring as many folks along as possible on that journey. And there are going to be risks associated with this. There always are when you're breaking new ground, but we believe it's more important if we feel like this is truly going to create some positive change. And if we go back to the example of confidence with women, what we were able to do was work that word so much so into the ether that even in calibration meetings where I was sitting in, I didn't have to call it out. People were calling it out left, right, and everywhere, right? Like that was the signal word of like bias is afoot. And it was wonderful to see, but we also then saw real results where in one performance cycle, women were then rated higher than men on average. So we know that these like in the weeds tactics work, and they help to build confidence, and to the point Rory made, stamina for people to keep going on some of the bigger initiatives that we're trying to drive forward. So that's just one example from us.
Awesome. I'm gonna go with Nicole next.
Awesome. So one of the first DEI programs that we really got up and running was our women's ERG. So when we started, I guess, our DEI journey as a company a couple of years ago, and I was doing that work, it was very easy to get, I think, held up sometimes comparing yourself to larger organizations or companies that had a far larger population and a lot more resources to do that work. And we found that we just had to pick one thing and focus on it. And then when we get that right, move to the next thing. In the women's ERG, we found in our EMPS surveys that women felt like they were really siloed from each other. So whilst we had women work in our company, they were often distributed in teams where they found that they were the only woman in the room or the only woman on the Zoom call. And so they didn't feel like they had that sense of community. and they wanted a group to be able to voice their concerns or speak with other people about their experiences with our company. So we started, it's called Women in Motion, our women's ERG, and we started that group. And it was really, in the beginning, a way for them to have a voice directly to our leadership team and to be able to escalate their qualitative feedback. And to get started, I would say it's really to find the need, and then to get buy-in from the group and really give them the resources in the room to get started. So since that group started, I mean, they have a clear mission and they have goals every year and a budget, and they have complete autonomy to spend it and work on what they want to. And they've organized trainings for their own group. So for the women's group, they've organized trainings, and they've organized trainings for our company as well. So we really let them just kind of operate, honestly, as in their own entity to make change. And I would say that's one of the programs that we're proudest of, because it really kind of got our DEI programming off the ground. And once we felt like that group was in the right spot and they could kind of work autonomously, it was focusing on the next thing and the next thing. And then, 2 years later, you kind of pause and you say, wow, without even realizing it, we were just focusing on all these small changes. Now we have this full DEI program with internships and working practices and an L&D aspect, and we've updated promotion process because of the feedback from women. And you've made a lot of change when you didn't even realize it. You were just focusing on the next thing to do and the next small thing that needed to be changed. And that all started with our women's ERG and just really starting to listening to the voices that we had in the company and what they had to say, and actually making the changes that they were asking for and moving quickly on it. So that's one of the programs that we started with and we're proudest of.
Thank you. And Rory, we'll give you the last use study before you go to questions.
Sure, Andre. So just incredible work in the organizations, KeyAnna and Nicole. It's just awesome hearing all this. I'll talk about two things. The first one's a little more straightforward, not so much detail behind it, but I think it builds nicely on what KeyAnna was saying and Nicole was saying as well. Is that our CHRO, we launched a communication campaign, and all it simply asked was, "How are you really?" And that really at the end was purposeful, and it was intentional in that it's an acknowledgement that no one is doing fine. No one is certainly doing as well as they were before the pandemic or before so many of these racial equity and social justice issues just came on full display. And it's an acknowledgement of that, and it's an encouragement that when you ask that question, you understand that people are going through some stuff. And with everything going on, how we were all just talking about that our work and our home lives are no longer separate. They never were, but now they're no longer separate, and that's on display every day. We have to acknowledge that. So when we ask that question, we have to mean it. We have to be prepared that you're going to get a response that is going to indicate that people are going through some difficult times, and we should be prepared to listen. And that's how we should all act in this time. So how are you really? So that opening question has been on the tops of agendas for different divisional, all hands meetings, different team meetings. It's simple and it's very powerful. Again, it takes stamina to ask that question, because especially for leaders who are used to running on a tight cadence, and we all have metrics and responsibilities and goals that we need to hit. When you ask that question in a staff meeting, the hope is that you'll get a good answer, meaning that you'll get a true answer and an opportunity for folks to listen, and that takes time. And sometimes things will get thrown off, but it's important to ask, and it's important to hear, and it's important for folks to understand that, hey, maybe there's something that we can do to help our colleague or to help people understand that some of these challenges that folks are going through, that I'm going through, other people are as well. So that's an opportunity to have a conversation that can help. So that's been one very effective and pretty straightforward thing that's been very impactful. The other, KeyAnna was bringing this up earlier, is that the COVID-19 pandemic, it really laid bare the disparities that were already in place, that already existed, but it's just lifted them up to the point that we see the horrific outcome of that. And we view racism at Blue Cross as a public health emergency, and healthcare as a racial and social justice issue. So when you have these disparate impacts on our Black and Brown communities in the state of COVID-19, and we learn more, we read more, we hear, and we unfortunately experience that these disparate impacts occur because of several different characteristics: unequal access to care, socioeconomic status. You have multi-generational homes where mom, grandma, daughter, grandchild are living under the same roof. Wage earners who are unable to work remotely. They have essential jobs. They have to go to work, whether that's at an office or a building or a store. And to do so, they have to rely on public transportation. So they were never able to step out of the daily commute, the daily going into work to work remotely. And pre-existing chronic conditions. And from a healthcare perspective, from a health plan perspective, that's our business. And when we're helping our members live healthier lives, it's all about managing their health and avoiding chronic conditions, pre-existing conditions. But they're there. There's a ton of information, a lot of research out there that shows that those chronic conditions disparately impact, again, the Black and Brown communities. So with all that in place in COVID-19, it's just created this environment in which these disparate health impacts have just been on full display and have been amplified. And again, going back to our enterprise focus on health disparities, if we're going to understand why those conditions exist in the first place, the multi-generational homes, the wage earners who are unable to work remotely, the chronic conditions, we have to understand structural racism, and we have to be aware as leaders and employees as we move our work forward, how racism and bias have shaped society and how that's critical to understanding why health disparities exist. So one of the programs that we've rolled out, and we have our senior leadership team going through it now, and we're going to continue to roll it out into 2021, is that we're building that awareness. And I'll use my own personal journey for this. And this has been one of those moments where I feel beyond surprised and almost very disappointed and embarrassed. There's so much history that I don't know. There are things that have been a blip in my history classes or whatnot, like the GI Bill or redlining and things of that nature, but I never really got that deep historical education to build that awareness of what really that means in a structural racism and especially health disparities context. So we've created an immersion program by which we kick it off with an engaging session and we have good conversations. And then for the next 21 days after that, we provide one piece of content to build that historical fact base of, again, how racism and bias have shaped society. So that's focusing in on racist federal housing administration policy that prevented Black Americans from purchasing homes in the suburbs when the suburbs were very much an innovative and a new concept. And to juxtapose that with what we learn about with redlining that goes on in urban areas, and to help people understand that when you look around in your suburb or your neighborhood, there is this thought, or I certainly had this thought, that maybe there was some self-selection that led up to this point and that people chose to live here and they chose to live elsewhere. No, that's not the case. There was policy, there was history involved in leading us to this point. And how does that factor into the accumulation of wealth if so many of our populations, our Black and Brown communities, have been unable to accumulate that wealth, to bequeath that wealth, or to use that wealth to manage through difficult times like a global pandemic when lots of jobs are lost? So it's building that fact base over a fairly long period of time, and it does feel relentless and it feels exhausting, but going back to what Nicole and KeyAnna have been talking about with regard to that stamina, that's the intent of the program. So we're going through that now, and that's really helped people understand and build that fact base of history. So it's less about feeling like someone's perspective or opinion is being put forth and focusing on the history and letting folks understand and build those connections to how that plays out and how it manifests today. And from a member perspective, how that has led to these disparate health impacts on our members during COVID-19. So that's been a positive aspect of this.
Great, thank you. Before I start doing the questioning, Sarah, do we have questions from the audience?
We don't. I think everybody is just so enamored with what this conversation is. Oh wait, I see a hand raised. Hold on a sec. It might be in chat. Hold on one second. Give me 1 second. They're typing as we speak. So.
All right. Well then, in true don't want dead air space, I'm going to do.
No. It's done. Okay. So
okay.
I'm working with a client who has good overall diversity numbers in their organization. However, they are trying to increase their leadership diversity and looking for ideas to do that?
Sure. So I'm happy to jump in on this one and hear from my colleagues here. But one thing that we did this year was we looked across our organization and said, what happens by level, right? So similar to what it sounds like your client did, we noticed a drop off at what we designate our senior manager plus level. And we noticed that drop off for both women and for Black employees as well as Latinx employees. And across the board, we have, our warehouses, which we call our field sites, customer service centers, that sort of thing, as well as our corporate offices. And it was the same across the board. So it's easier for us to opt on universal pieces to move forward and say like, hey, we're all going to work at this same goal. So we set goals around recruiting and hiring for senior women and senior Black and brown people. And we did that explicitly because a lot of times when you just say women, what ends up happening is that you hire a lot more white women than you do women of color. And we wanted to make sure that we got at both the race and the gender piece that we were seeing, in addition to knowing that there are people who identify as women plus, as well as, our men that we would like to see in leadership that are men of color as well. And so a few things that we have done is also look for those particular partnerships that allow us to speak to that audience and partner with our ERGs, so our Way Black ERGs, our Women Plus at Work, and our Women Plus in Tech ERGs to understand what is it that brought you to Wayfair? What is it that keeps you at Wayfair? How can we make sure that we're telling these stories and that we're allowing people to see the inclusive environment that we have while also admitting where we have work to do? And that has been really helpful, and people that typically don't necessarily consider Wayfair to think of Wayfair first for job opportunity, but also then to explore Wayfair's culture with us and giving us an opportunity to share like, hey, here's what we have going on. Come join us. And to that point of, many hands make light work, come help us make Wayfair better. Share your thoughts and ideas, and sharing examples with them similar to Nicole of where our ERGs really, brought an idea forward, moved it forward, and now that's a key program that we have here in the organization. So that has been really impactful, as well as speaking with the individuals at that level who identify with those key demographics to understand where they feel like potential pitfalls are, so that we make sure that we go back to our processes and figure out where is the process or the system actively preventing them from being successful, so that there's both an internal career development pillar as well as an external recruiting and hiring component to this work.
Yeah.
Nicole, I'd love to hear if you have some insights from a smaller organization's perspective on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what KeyAnna said was phenomenal, and I couldn't agree more with all of it. I think a trap that smaller organizations fall into is that whenever you open a role, it's typically you needed to hire them yesterday. And so, you're already starting behind the finish line, and you fall into this trap, especially I think tech startups of the referrals. Oh, this person was from my MBA program, and this person was from my last company. And so you're kind of pushing forward the people who look like you and who sound like you and who think like you. And I just think this is going to sound like such obvious advice, but your net of candidates is not going to widen unless you force it to. And so it's really being critical. And this is something we're going through because we have 2 leadership roles we're recruiting for now. And it's where are our jobs posted? Where do we source for candidates? What's our sourcing criteria? Like one of the jobs that we had, one of the requirements was you had to have been in a leadership role at a Fortune 500, whatever the was. And you're like, okay, well, if you take a step back, if somebody 10 years ago was in a leadership role in a Fortune 500, what are the chances that we're giving a fair opportunity to people who have a more diverse background? And so it's just being really critical and forcing yourself. Like, I know we're busy. I know we have goals to hit, but we can afford to lose a couple days in changing our sourcing efforts if it's going to be for the greater good overall.
Do you mind if I just jump in? There's a bunch of questions, and I'm seeing that we have 10 minutes. And so I'm wondering if rather than everybody answer.
Yep, no, that's great.
So sorry, Rory. I just want to make sure we get to everything. So maybe you can take this one.
Sure.
and there's a follow-up. So I'm going to read the question and then I'm going to read the follow-up. So it's, I'm curious about how organizations who are working to increase diversity numbers manage the people part of this. By that, I mean, what kinds of resources or support are organizations building to support inclusion as well as fluid adoption of this goal of inclusion? I work with the folks entering the workforce, and I see there's a lot of struggle with acclimation, not just in the new employee part, but also for the organization. I hope to guide them to look, this is the follow-up, I hope to guide them to look for organizations that are not just focused on the numbers, but on individual success, which, as we all know, leads to overall business success.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it touches on a couple of the themes that KeyAnna and Nicole have brought up with regards to building that coalition, many hands, and embedding this in the enterprise. And even when we're talking about different trainings and different programs that we can roll out, and we're talking about how do we diversify leadership, I cannot help but think about that theme of stamina, in that this is why it's so critical to have a coalition of folks who are champions and advocates and are believers of diversity, equity, inclusion from a talent perspective of the work that you do, because you're making good progress. And then you see something like the OFCCP reach out to Microsoft and say, hey, tell us about your plan for how you want to diversify leaders, because it sounds like discrimination. Or you're putting together a program that's really geared towards helping people understand those systemic inequities that lead to structural racism that are just critical for us to understand. And then you see an executive order that says diversity training is something that we really want to look into. That's when you need that stamina. And that's when you need that coalition of leaders throughout the organization that you can lean on. And when you have those moments when you just think to yourself like, oh, there are other folks who are going to pick you up, who are going to say, we can work through this, we're going to figure this thing out. And in a similar way to when you're thinking about different individuals, or at least for us stepping into the organization, we had a great conversation about this yesterday during our prep call, and that when we think about inclusion, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is our corporate real estate partners and our information technology partners. And they are believers, and they understand that in this all virtual environment, when we have our service associates who require 2 monitors and to be hardwired into the router, that comes with an assumption of space, that comes with an assumption of internet bandwidth, and that comes with an assumption that you can get a quiet place where you can interact with our members while having all that equipment there. And that's an equity issue, and that's an equity concern. So we need to get everybody at the table to try to work through these things so we can have a good structure in place for the right people to think about these things in all aspects of talent coming into the organization. So if it's hiring 1 or 2 people for this cycle, because we don't have a lot of requisitions now, we're going to make sure that they can assimilate and that they can fit in there. So I'll stop there so the rest of the team can respond.
Yeah, I think I would just quickly jump in, because Nicole, Andre, and myself were also having this conversation right before we started the session, which is, working with partners like Apprenti or Hack Diversity or, Reach Hire or Resilient Coders. For us, it's understanding that we don't just need like the programmatic support of how do we hire these folks, get them in, and then send them off to the races. We also need to, support our managers and set clear expectations with them, and then have that feedback loop with the program as well to understand where they are seeing patterns or noticing themes around how their people are or are not being supported to be successful, so that we can then, jump in those moments. I will say that for us, one of the ERGs that we have are boot camp grads. And we have that group because they felt like, hey, we don't feel like we're being treated as fairly as we should be. We have some ideas on how this could work better. And they are one of our best partners for understanding where are the gaps that we haven't picked up on, where we can just add enhanced programmatic support so that you all feel like you have enough information on the environment to come in and be successful, but then also to leave your own thumbprint on the environment, right? Because we don't just want assimilation. We want people to feel like they can create a space for themselves and help to influence the space that they're in.
Great.
Got some more questions, yeah. Let's see. What did I just lost.
And Nicole, be aware you're up to start the next question, whatever it is.
We are looking, I have 2 questions that have come in. So let me maybe I read them both and then
Right.
and take them both. We are looking at starting a mentorship program internally that would incorporate senior leaders who would be mentors to participants of the program. But what suggestions would you have when our senior leadership team doesn't exactly represent diversity? And I know that's come up before in other conversations we've had. For Nicole or others, how do you recommend sourcing diverse candidates? We use LinkedIn and Indeed in many of the major diversity boards, and still we are not getting enough diverse candidates. So we are stepping up our passive sourcing game. Would love your suggestions on this.
I can take the sourcing question because that's something I've actually been in multiple sourcing sessions this week, particularly for our DEI programs. One thing I would say is that if you're not seeing the inbound applicants, it's really worth considering partnerships, especially in the Boston community. Like KeyAnna and Rory were saying, there's so many partners. And as a small company, we used to be really, we weren't that engaged with that idea because we would just assume a partner is going to ask us for this really huge fee that we can't afford. Or, you know, we would think of it like a recruiting relationship. Oh, we can't afford to have sourcing agencies or all these other groups. And then you realize when you start doing your research that like Year Up or other programs, that it's actually quite affordable. And it's no different than hiring someone directly. And there's amazing organizations in Boston that have the same values and mission as you to be able to place people and give them opportunities. And so it's considering, I think, that avenue. And for us, more so than posting on job boards, that has been the most beneficial, is actually trying to use connections more and just say, hey, we're struggling as a company to find a diverse group of candidates and we need some assistance. And there's been tons of organizations willing to help us. I don't know if KeyAnna or Rory want to expand on that, because I know you both mentioned your partnerships as well.
Yeah. I'll channel my boss, Stephanie Brown. She's our Chief Diversity Officer, and you know, she says often, you got to do the work. And for example, there's a Men of Color event that's coming up in November. It's a wonderful place to build relationships, start building your network. And those are the types of things that you have to be on the lookout all the time, because it takes work, not just to form the relationships or to grab a partner, but to really build these meaningful relationships, to build your network. And to go through that process, it takes a lot of time and energy and effort, and it's an investment, and you're going to get the best talent out of that. So I'll check and say you got to do the work.
All right, if kind of something to say real quick, great. If not, it's 10:59, so I want to make sure we have a chance to give everyone real quick opportunity to say, if there's one thing you hope people take away from this call, what is it? And we'll start with you, KeyAnna.
Sure. I think it's tenacity in your commitment, and just the drive to keep moving forward. You know, to the last point mentioned, it does take time, and a lot of these communities that we're tapping into are a little bit skeptical of us, right? So how are we showing them that we're in this for the long haul, and how are we showing our people that we're in it for the long haul? And really that comes down to our tenacity and commitment.
Rory?
I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion is one of the most important pieces to make healthcare work better for everyone. And there are those statements to be made in any industry, any business model. And once you get and you believe in that and you start getting that traction, that, you know, that's when you can really start making good progress, getting more hands, and really embedding a lot of these programs. So.
And Nicole?
Just building off what KeyAnna and Rory have said, I think it's important to just get started. DEI can be a really scary topic and a big one, and nobody has all of the answers. And so just pick one thing and work at it, and then pick the next thing. But just get going.
Great. Thank you all. I will turn it over to Sarah to close us out.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andre, Nicole, KeyAnna, Rory. It was phenomenal. I really, for you shared a lot of not just your insights in what you do, but how you feel about it, and was just so key for today. So I appreciate that. That's a really difficult thing to do. There are some questions we did not get to. I'm gonna send them around to you all and maybe hope for some answers. And then we'll we'll provide those answers in my follow-up to the audience. I want to very quickly also thank our sponsors, Wayfair, Mimecast, and then Akamai and PTC for underwriting our social justice initiatives. And I hope to see you all next week for our final in the series. Thank you so much. Have a great day.